We'll give everyone just another minute or so to join, and we'll get started. And for those of you who are on, this webinar will be recorded, and we will share that after the webinar. All right. Well, as more folks start trickling in, we can go ahead and get started. We have a lot of conversation to cover today, and let's begin. So hello, everyone, and welcome to today's session. My name is Eric Gunderson, and I am a Senior Account Manager here at Redpath, and I will be hosting today's conversation. First and foremost, I'd like to thank everyone who is able to join us today and taking time out of your schedules. We have an important topic ahead of us that will impact just about every Salesforce environment across the globe. For those of you who might be new to Redpath, we are a Salesforce consulting partner that specializes in working with healthcare companies, higher education institutions, and nonprofit organizations across the United States. We are headquartered in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and are a team of about 45 people. And we've been helping organizations in the three verticals that I mentioned since about 2008. And today, we will be discussing multi-factor authentication and the importance of taking action on the requirement that Salesforce is unveiling before February. To help walk us through this change, we are fortunate to be joined by Ben Koch, one of Redpath's Salesforce developers. Ben has a passion for cybersecurity and is really going to help us lead this conversation today. He's a skilled full stack developer focused on Salesforce and holds a degree in information systems from the University of Wisconsin, Eau Claire. And today, Ben works with many of our nonprofit and higher education clients here at Redpath. Before coming to Redpath, he worked as a product support analyst at a global corporation. If you all have questions throughout this webinar, please feel free to add them in the chat, and we will reserve some time at the end to answer them. Again, we welcome your questions, and be sure to feel free to chime in and speak up if you have any questions. And again, for those of you joining us, welcome. Ben, do you want to go to the next slide?
Yeah, I click next slide. It's still showing the first one for you.
I think so.
You able to see it now?
It looks like we can see it now, yes. Perfect. So during the next 30 minutes or so, more like 25 minutes now, we hope to accomplish the following objectives. Really, our first goal is to help everyone understand what multi-factor authentication is and how it plays a role in your everyday lives. Why it is growing increasingly important given the current impact of recent events that have happened on cyber attacks on huge corporations and huge companies around the globe, and specifically how your organization can satisfy the multi-factor authentication requirements being put in place by Salesforce on February 2nd. Now, I'd like to turn it over to you, Ben, to talk through today's security landscape.
Thanks, Eric, and thanks everybody for joining. I just want to double check and make sure you see the next slide now, that today's security landscape one. Okay, I think I had to slide over to the other screen in order to get it to show. But yeah, hopefully today we can clarify some questions that anybody might have about multi-factor authentication and the impending requirement that Salesforce is putting in place. When I was in college, I completed an internship in cybersecurity for actually the largest private company in the United States. And the experience that I had there really opened my eyes to how relevant cyber threats are on a day-to-day basis. And today in particular, the threats are absolutely skyrocketing. In order to help quantify it, I wanted to share the results of some cyber threat reporting data that was actually released by Interpol, the International Criminal Police Organization. In one 4-month period in 2020, so actually January to April, Interpol had 907,000 spam messages, 737 malware infections, and 48,000 malicious URLs reported to them. Now, that's almost 1 million threats. What if I told you those were only the threats that were directly related to COVID-19? So just a fraction of the total. There are all kinds of different goals of these threats, but the most common objective is to try and gain access to a user's account. With more and more people starting to work from home during the pandemic and companies being forced to try and keep up with the changing times, they're standing up infrastructures that are, quite frankly, not suited to handle the increasing amounts of cyber threats that we see in their many forms. It's more important now than ever to safeguard access to Salesforce's user accounts, because the harsh reality of it is, on their own, usernames and passwords just no longer provide sufficient protection because of their susceptibility to common threats like phishing attacks. So speaking of phishing, let's talk a little bit about it. Most of us probably know what it is and know about it by now, but in case you're unfamiliar, phishing is when an attacker sends an email, almost always pretending to be a legitimate organization or a person, and that email contains a link to a malicious website or contains a malicious attachment. And if someone clicks on the link, they can either be redirected to a fake version of a login form where they'll enter in their user credentials and give their username and password to a hacker. Or they could click on the malicious malware attachment and it could install programs on their computer which allow them to collect that user's sensitive data. On the screen, you can see a few statistics that further drive home the impact of phishing. And I'm not going to read them all to you, but I wanted to draw your attention specifically to the one at the bottom of the page. A lot of people, they hear about phishing and they see an example and they think, like, who's actually going to click on these links, right? Like, it's so obvious, it's poorly made. But the reality of the situation is that nearly 1 in 3 phishing messages are opened by the targeted users. And when I was doing that cybersecurity internship that I previously mentioned, one of the things that we did there was we actually created our own internal phishing program, obviously not with anything malicious, but just to try and get a little bit of an idea of how susceptible we were to phishing attacks. So we sent out these emails that had some clear malicious signs, so to speak, but the links were more informational. They didn't obviously have anything bad. So a user would click on it and it'd say, "Oops, this was a replication of a phishing attempt, and here are some ways to avoid it in the future." But what we found was actually a very similar number to that 30%, which is actually quite horrifying when you think about it. But the fact is, it's not necessarily that people are susceptible or gullible or just don't notice. It's that they are so busy or they're swamped with all these kinds of things that they'll go ahead and see a subject line. They're like, "Oh yeah, you know what? I do have to do that." They don't even read the content of the email. They just click on the link that's in there and they put in their information. And before you know it, it's too late. There are a lot of reasons why the bad actors might want to get Salesforce accounts, because once they get into a user's account and they get their login credentials, it can create a big snowball effect. Depending on the user that they hack, they could get various levels of information, where they could assume somebody's identity to get critical data. They could send email from that person's account so it looks even more legitimate. They could get access to financial information, make large purchases. They could even add code to an Experience Cloud site that scans for card information that gets entered and stores it. And these can obviously have a really negative impact on the organization that user is working for and using Salesforce for, like lost revenue, brand image, and actually legal monetary fines that can be incurred. So all of that is where multi-factor authentication comes in, because it's one of the simplest, easiest, most effective ways to prevent unauthorized account access and to safeguard customer data. So now that you have an understanding of the importance of multi-factor authentication, I'm going to kind of try and clarify what it is exactly. Multi-factor authentication, referred to as MFA, or sometimes you'll hear it referred to as two-factor authentication, requires the user to verify their identity with two or more pieces of evidence or factors to prove that they are who they say they are. The first factor is something that the user knows. In this case, it's almost always their username and password, their login credentials. And the second factor is usually a physical device of some sort, and it's their verification method. And that we like to describe as something that the user has. It's like an authenticator app or a security key. And I'm going to talk about the verification methods that Salesforce allows here in a couple of minutes. A familiar example of multi-factor authentication that you use all the time in a different setting is when you go and get money out of your ATM. You have your PIN, which you enter, that's something that you know, and then you have your card that you actually insert into the machine, that's something that you have. So it's two layers of authentication there to prevent attacks. So let's say an attacker obtains a user's username and password from a valid phishing attack. With multi-factor authentication in place, because the code or notification has been sent to the real user's mobile device, not only will the attacker be blocked from accessing the account, but the user will actually know immediately that their credentials have been compromised due to the notification that they received. And then they can go in and change their password, try to identify where that information might have gotten taken, and warn other users that may have gotten the exact same email before they do the same mistake. So for all the reasons that we mentioned here already, Salesforce has announced that beginning on February 1st, 2.5 weeks, less than a month, all customers are required to enable multi-factor authentication for the users that are logging into Salesforce products. So what options do we have to actually satisfy this requirement? The first one is straightforward. It's just enabling multi-factor authentication directly in Salesforce for the users who are logging into the interface. The second option is actually sort of an inherent multi-factor authentication method, and that's through using an SSO provider. Not all SSO providers technically use multi-factor authentication, so not every SSO solution will satisfy this requirement. But if the SSO provider is using an MFA service, then this will satisfy the Salesforce requirement as well. A nice thing about this is if you have some SSO users already and some that you don't want to have on SSO, you can actually mix and match these solutions so that your users can kind of have a tailored experience. So if you're thinking, I think we might have multi-factor authentication enabled because when I use a new computer, it sends a code to my email or my phone. But that's actually different. That doesn't qualify as multi-factor authentication. That's what we call device activation. It requires a second factor when you're accessing it on a new device, but that factor is not a strong method. It's email or SMS, which can pretty easily be intercepted. And it doesn't require the user to verify every time they log in. So MFA is every single login, and it requires a strong verification method, which I will list out here in a minute. The best all-around scenario is when you can combine multi-factor authentication and single sign-on, because then you have the security of MFA, but you have the convenience and ease of use of single sign-on. So they need to authenticate, but only once, and then they can use a wide variety of applications. This is generally going to result in some happier users when you have that set up. So MFA can be enabled in Salesforce a couple different ways. You can apply a permission set directly to users, or you can modify users' existing profiles. It's also possible to mix and match these solutions, so your org can be accommodated for this requirement, no matter how it's currently set up. A frequent question that I've gotten about this requirement is, what about our users who are set up for API integrations? They don't necessarily log in. That's a good question. There are actually two different types of permissions that we can enable for multi-factor authentication. And for the Salesforce requirement on February 1st, only users who are user interface logins are requiring multi-factor authentication. So there's actually a setting on the users called API only. And if you have an API only user that's hooked up for your integrations, that user does not have to have multi-factor authentication required. But there is also a permission in Salesforce called MFA for API logins that you can enable for those users. It's not required, but it's available there if you're looking for that additional security and consistency throughout all of your users. Okay, so a couple times I think I've said that I was going to talk about the methods that are available in a couple of minutes. Well, here we are. The four kind of blocks that you see on your screen here are the four strong verification methods that Salesforce has identified as valid and will meet their MFA requirements. So after you enable the multi-factor authentication, the user will be prompted to choose a strong verification method, so any of these four, and that's up to their discretion, as their second factor when they attempt to log in. The four options that you can see are the Salesforce Authenticator mobile app. That's a nice, fast, native, free solution that they provide. There are third-party authenticator apps, which work in a very similar way as the Salesforce app, but you might already be using for Google, Microsoft. Some people use Authy. There are physical securities like little flash drives that you plug in instead of getting a notification. And there are also built-in authenticators. So it can prompt you to do like a touch ID, face ID, Windows Hello, some things like that. Salesforce doesn't allow email, SMS, phone calls as verification methods because, like I mentioned before, those are easily intercepted and they can be compromised a lot more easily than by using a third-party app or the native app or a physical device. So the first method is the Salesforce Authenticator app. I'm going to go a little bit more into detail about what that's like. Like I said, it's free, it's native, it's seamless to use with Salesforce, and it consists of 5 pieces of information every time the login attempt happens so that the user can easily identify if it's a valid attempt or if it's somebody trying to impersonate them. There's the action, so it's a login. There's the user, so you can see your username, the service, so it'll tell you what URL or product the login attempt is from, and the device that the user is using. So you can see, well, I don't use a MacBook. Why does it say that it's a Mac that's trying to log in? And then the location. So that one's pretty straightforward. Once they try to log in, they just get a push notification on the app. They can verify that everything's good, and they click approve, and they're in. It's also kind of nice because you can automate that process with this app where trusted locations are involved. So if you're in the office and you're working in the same place every day, you can save that location as a trusted location. And when you try to log in, it will automatically approve it. So the user doesn't actually have any manual steps involved. Another way to secure this would be to have like a biometric pin or scan on your phone just to get into your phone. So it's another layer of security on top of it. That also applies with the third-party authenticator apps. Like I said before, they work basically the same way as the Salesforce app, but this is like a phrase. So you'll get a unique phrase sent to your phone, and you have to type that into the browser to verify that it's you. The codes are usually valid for about 30 seconds or so, and then if they're not approved, the user gets denied. This would be a recommended method if you're already using a suite of products like Microsoft Office or the G Suite from Google, because then you can not have to juggle multiple applications and just kind of integrate it all into one app and create a smoother experience for your users. The third option here is a physical security key. You'll probably encounter these less often. They are like a flash drive or a thumb drive that the user can plug into their computer instead of getting a code sent somewhere. It's a good solution if a organization doesn't supply mobile devices and users don't want to use their own, or you work in an environment where mobile devices aren't permitted. So like a high security type, maybe for the government or something like that. But it's pretty simple. It works the same way. You attempt to log in, it prompts you, it says, please insert your device. You plug it in, usually push a button, and it's valid. The final method is a built-in authenticator, which, like I mentioned, is a biometric scan of some sort, like a Face ID, or it can even be a PIN or a password that the user set up in the actual device's operating system. So not in Salesforce, but on the actual phone or laptop that the user is using. This doesn't require a separate app or a physical key or anything. So this can be a pretty seamless method to choose. And it's a great option, like I said, if users don't have physical ports on their devices that they're using to plug in a device like a flash drive. So I want to walk through the user experience of setting up one of the verification methods really quick. And in this case, we're going to assume that the verification method that was chosen is the Authenticator app, the Salesforce Authenticator app. So all you need to do as a user is get the app from the App Store and attempt to log into your browser as usual. Once you get in, you're going to see this Connect Salesforce Authenticator screen that you see in box 3. For the third-party options or the physical devices, there's actually a little blue text that's probably really small on your screen at the very bottom in box 3 that says choose another verification method. So that's how you would go about setting up a different one. But in this case, you would go ahead and hit the blue button, and on your mobile device, open up the app. Okay, once the app is opened up, it's going to give you a code for the very first time, and you return to the browser and enter in the code, and that code is unique to the person who's getting it, basically worldwide, so no one else should have that same code, and it will recognize that device and form a link there. Then after you punch in the code, you'll get the notification to check your mobile device, which will send the prompt that you will normally get, a push notification, with the attempt to log in, and you confirm it, and voila, the account will be added. And now every time you go back in to attempt logging in, you'll just get the prompt on your phone. After the steps have been completed, the verification method is linked to that user permanently. Well, I shouldn't say permanently, but it's indefinitely linked to that user. And if they, for some reason, want to change their verification method, or if they want to, or they get a new phone, lose their device, something like that, and a Salesforce administrator is capable of unlinking the method for them. And then the next time they log in, they'll be prompted to set up a new verification method, just like they did the first time. So Salesforce recommends that you roll out multi-factor authentication in kind of a group of 3 stages. I agree that it's really important to do this rollout in phases rather than kind of going gung-ho and just turning on MFA for everyone, because there are a lot of important things that might get missed. I want to call out specifically in group 1 or in stage 1 here, get ready, inventory users, roles, and permissions. I think it's really important to ask the questions, how many users do we have? How many are currently using SSO? Maybe some of them are already using MFA. How do we want to roll it out for the users that need it so that we don't have double authentication methods on certain users? And then if we try to disable it, we have to go through, hoops to get it all disabled, things like that. I think those are really important questions to ask in order to enable the best experience, not only for the users, but for your administrators as well. Stage 2 then is to roll out, actually execute the plan and implement MFA, launch it to the users. And in stage 3, I think it's really important to note that once the rollout is complete, it's not really done. I think there's an important step here of making sure users are successfully logging in and that they're having a decent user experience, because there are ways to tailor that experience, like I talked about early on with SSO, in order to make it a little more streamlined for them. And you don't want your users to be really unhappy. So there's definitely ways that you can make it better for them if they're not having a good experience with MFA, which by nature is not going to be people's favorite things to begin with. So Salesforce has done a really great job of providing documentation and resources out there for understanding MFA and the impending requirement. A bunch of those resources are listed here. I highly recommend the Salesforce MFA FAQ, frequently asked questions. It answered personally some questions that I had, and it's just a really good resource for you to try and do it on your own. That said, if you have any questions right now, I'd be happy to try and answer them. And if not, I will pass it back to Eric, but I will give it a couple minutes, see if you have any questions, and then we'll go ahead and take a shot at answering some of those.
Yeah, thank you, Ben. Appreciate you going over this. A few questions came in as you were speaking. One of them, does the multi-factor authentication require that every user needs a unique login license, given the requirement for something that they have?
That's a good question that I've seen come up a few times. And I think the general consensus going forward is yes, every user should have a unique login license, whether that's a consulting partner coming in and working on your org. The users are going to need their own license to be able to log in on their own. Same with all of your day-to-day users.
Okay, great. And then another one, is Duo something that would satisfy the Salesforce requirement for MFA?
I believe Duo has an SSO, a full service SSO setup. So that includes a multi-factor authentication provider. I believe, yes, it will satisfy the requirement, provided it's set up appropriately and that multi-factor authentication is enabled while using Duo. So if there are further questions on that or specific questions on that, you can reach out to us. We'd be happy to try and help walk through making sure everything is set up appropriately to satisfy the requirement.
Great. And there are several different methods that you can take to sort of employ multi-factor authentication. Can you sort of use a variety of different methods across users? Like, for instance, if one user group prefers the Salesforce Authenticator, another group is very tied to the Google Authenticator, and yet a third group is really loyal to Mac and they'd like to use Touch ID, can you enable different methods across user groups?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's one of the best things here is that if you as an organization care to do it this way, you can basically just enable multi-factor authentication for the users, and then it's up to them to select the verification method of their choice. So every user is unique in that sense, where like you're mentioning, if one person wants to use a Salesforce Authenticator app and the other person wants to use Face ID or something like that, they can go ahead and select that on their own. And they'll be doing that in the steps to set up their method the first time they try to log in. And then there's obviously also the option as an organization to kind of standardize a method to go through and have everybody try to be consistent. But that's really up to you. And yes, it is definitely possible.
That's great. Thank you, Ben. And to all the attendees, thank you very much for your time this afternoon. We hope this was very helpful. If you have any questions, you're welcome to reach out to your account manager or your primary representative at Redpath for further information. Thanks again, all. Have a great afternoon. Happy Tuesday.
Thanks, everybody.